The deed was already signed. Mabel Keene stood in the doorway of the Hadley ranch house, the yellowed paper trembling in her hand, and she watched Milton Hadley's face drain of every drop of color it had ever held. His jaw went rigid. His eyes dropped to that paper, then snapped back up to hers, and in that single, suspended heartbeat between them, she saw something she had never expected to see on the face of the proudest man in Colton County, Texas. She saw devastation. "What have you done?" he said. It was not a question. His voice came out low and stripped bare, like a cottonwood branch after a flood had torn every leaf away. "I saved it," Mabel said, keeping her voice steady even though her hands were shaking hard enough to rattle the paper. "I saved your ranch, Milton. You had no right." The words came out like gravel being ground under a boot heel. He stepped toward her, and for one wild second she thought he might grab that deed from her hands. "You had no right to do this behind my back." Behind your back, she kept her ground. She had not ridden 14 miles through a dust storm in the middle of August to crumble in a doorway. You were going to lose everything in 3 days. The bank was coming with a sheriff's deputy and a padlock. I went to the land office and I settled the debt, every penny of it. With whose money? His eyes narrowed, and she could see the moment the full truth of it started moving through him like a slow poison. "Mabel, whose money did you use?" She lifted her chin. "Mine." The silence that followed was the loudest thing she had ever heard in her 26 years of living. Milton Hadley turned away from her. He pressed one large hand flat against the doorframe and stood there with his back to her, his broad shoulders heaving with a breath so controlled it looked painful. And Mabel watched the line of his spine and thought about all the months that had led to this moment. All the stubbornness and silence and hidden suffering that had brought two people who could have saved each other to this breaking point on a hot August morning in 1883. She had loved him for almost a year. He had never once asked her for a single thing, and that, she now understood, had always been the trap. It had started the previous October when the rains came wrong. Colton County sat at the edge of the Texas Hill Country, where the limestone gave way to red clay, and the rivers either flooded you or abandoned you depending on their mood. The Hadley Ranch had been on that land since 1861, when Milton's father, Thomas Hadley, had arrived from Georgia with a wagon, a pregnant wife, $300, and a stubbornness that had apparently been passed down in the blood like a family heirloom. Thomas Hadley had died in the spring of 1879, leaving the ranch to his only surviving son. Milton was 27 at the time, and he had taken the inheritance with the same grim, square jaw he took everything else. He had run the ranch through drought and cattle sickness and a terrible winter in 1881 that had killed 30 head of cattle in a single week. He had done it all without complaint. He had done it without borrowing a dime more than the standing mortgage his father had left on the land. That mortgage had been the secret. Not a secret everyone knew was a secret, the way most things in small towns are. Just a quiet, persistent, dark fact that Milton Hadley carried like a stone in his chest, while he smiled at folks in the street and tipped his hat at church and bought rounds at the Silver Spur Saloon on the first Saturday of every month, because that was what men of standing did, and he was determined to appear to be a man of standing. Mabel Keene had arrived in Colton, Texas in December of 1882, which meant she had only known Milton Hadley in the context of his deterioration, though she had not understood that until much later. She had come from San Antonio, where she had worked as a schoolteacher for 3 years after completing her education at a women's academy in Austin. She had taken the position in Colton because the town needed a teacher badly enough to offer a reasonable wage and a small house on the east edge of town, and because Mabel Keene, who had been entirely on her own since her father's death from a fever in 1880, had decided that small towns were safer than large cities for a woman traveling alone through a territory where the law was still more suggestion than certainty. She was not what most people expected when they expected a schoolteacher. She was tall for a woman, nearly 5'7", With dark auburn hair she wore pinned firmly at the back of her neck, and sharp green eyes that missed very little. She had her father's practical mind and her mother's capacity for feeling things deeply and quietly, and she had learned from 3 years of teaching in San Antonio that the combination made her both highly capable and highly susceptible to caring too much about people who had decided not to care about themselves. Milton Hadley had walked into her schoolroom in January of 1883, on a Tuesday afternoon when the children had gone home, and she was grading arithmetic papers at her desk. He had knocked on the open door, and she had looked up, and that had been the beginning of all of it. He was 31 years old. He was 6'2" of sun-weathered, quietly serious Texas rancher, with dark hair that needed cutting and brown eyes that were set deep under a straight brow and a jaw that looked like it had been carved with a tool meant for stone. He held his hat in both hands the way men did when they wanted to appear respectful, and he said, "Miss Keene, I apologize for interrupting. I'm Milton Hadley. My neighbor's boy, young Danny Pruitt, he's been struggling with his reading. I was wondering if you might take extra time with him." Mabel had looked at him for a moment. "Does Danny Pruitt's father know you've come to speak for him?" "No, ma'am. Tom Pruitt's a proud man. He won't ask." She had almost smiled at that. "You're asking on his behalf?" "Yes, ma'am. And if I agree, how do you propose to explain to Mr. Pruitt that I'm giving his son special attention?" Milton had considered this very briefly. "I'll tell him it's standard practice for students who are behind." "That's not entirely the truth." "No, ma'am, but it's a kindness that won't wound his pride, and the end result will be the same." She had thought about that answer for a long time afterward. There was something in it she recognized, a particular logic about protecting people from the weight of their own help needing, and she had found it both admirable and, she would later conclude, deeply telling about the man who held it. They had spoken perhaps 6 more times over the following 2 months. At church, where he sat in the 3rd pew from the front and she sat in the 5th. At the general store, where they had once reached for the same tin of coffee at the same moment and laughed, both surprised. At the town's spring social in March, where he had asked her to dance with such a formality she had almost expected him to bow. He had danced well. He held her at the proper distance and kept his eyes on her face the whole time, and she had the distinct sensation that he was concentrating very hard on not letting himself concentrate too hard. She had started paying attention to him the way you pay attention to a puzzle that presents itself to you repeatedly. By April, she had noticed that the Hadley Ranch hands were down to 2 where there had been 4. By May, she noticed that Milton was taking his meals at the Widow Patterson's boarding house on Thursdays instead of cooking for himself, which suggested his food supplies were being carefully rationed. In June, she overheard a conversation at the post office, the kind people have in a low voice that they think no one nearby is hearing, between the postmaster and his wife. "Hadley's 3 months behind," the postmaster's wife had murmured. "He'll sort it," her husband replied. "How? That October freeze killed half his cattle. He doesn't have the stock to sell. He's a proud man. He'll find a way." Mabel had addressed her letter very carefully, then walked out of the post office and stood in the June heat and thought about that conversation. She had gone home and written a letter to her father's old banker in San Antonio, a man named Gerald Holt, who had helped her settle her father's modest estate, and who had, in the process, become something like a trusted advisor. She asked Gerald Holt 2 very specific questions. First, she asked about the current legal procedures for settling a delinquent land mortgage in Texas. Second, she asked how much money she currently had access to in her savings account at the San Antonio National Bank. The answer to the second question arrived 2 weeks later. It was more than she needed, though not by a wide margin. She had not done anything with that information immediately. She had waited, because she understood that the situation might resolve itself, and because she was also aware that she was in danger of doing something that came from a place that was not entirely practical. She was in danger of doing something that came from the place in her chest that fluttered inconveniently every time Milton Hadley tipped his hat at her on the street. July came. She heard from Danny Pruitt, who had become a good reader and was now an enthusiastic student, that Mr. Hadley had sold his mother's silver flatware to the assay office. She heard from the blacksmith's wife that Milton had turned down a dinner invitation from the Colton Ladies' Social Committee for the second time that season, which was unusual for a man who had always been considerate of town obligations. She noticed, at the 4th of July celebration, that he stood at the edge of the firelight rather than in the middle of it. She noticed that he drank one glass of lemonade and nothing else. She noticed that he watched the sky with the kind of watchfulness that was not admiring the stars but calculating something. She walked over to him. "Beautiful night," she said. "Yes, ma'am." "You seem troubled, Mr. Hadley." He looked at her. In the firelight, those dark eyes were unreadable in the way that very full containers are sometimes unreadable, too much inside to see the contents clearly. "Just thinking about weather," he said. "Is the ranch doing well?" The pause was very small, almost imperceptible. "Well enough," he said. That was the moment she knew it was a lie, and also the moment she understood that he would never admit otherwise. Not to her, not to anyone. After the 4th of July, she began to move. She wrote to Gerald Holt again, this time with specific instructions. She asked him to find out, through the appropriate legal channels, the exact outstanding amount on the mortgage for the Hadley Ranch property, registered in Colton County. She asked him to prepare the funds for transfer, contingent on her final word. Gerald Holt wrote back a cautious letter. He reminded her that this was a significant sum. He reminded her that land debts in Texas were governed by specific statutes, and that a mortgage could not simply be paid by a third party without the deed transferring to that third party as a matter of default legal procedure, unless specific arrangements were made. He outlined what those arrangements were. Mabel read the letter 3 times. Then she wrote back and asked him to make the arrangements. The process took 3 weeks and involved 2 trips to the county seat by a legal representative Gerald Holt had employed on her behalf, a man named Arthur Dempsey who was apparently both efficient and discreet. The arrangement Mabel had made was unusual but legal. She would pay the full outstanding debt, including all accrued interest. The deed would be released from the mortgage lien, but the deed would not transfer to Mabel. It would be returned to its original holder, Milton Hadley, free and clear. In exchange for this, Mabel Keene would hold a personal promissory note, not a lien on the property, signed by the bank's representative as witness, stating that Milton Hadley owed her the principal amount at no interest, repayable at any time and under no penalty if not repaid within his lifetime. In other words, she had effectively given him the money and created a piece of paper that legally meant very little and could never be enforced against his land. The bank had been surprised. The bank had also been motivated, because the alternative was a foreclosure proceeding that would cost them time and legal fees, and a property they had no particular interest in managing. The deed had been signed free and clear on the morning of August 14, 1883. Mabel had ridden out to the Hadley Ranch that same afternoon, and so there they were. Milton Hadley with his hand on the doorframe and his back turned to her, and Mabel Keene in the doorway with the deed in her hand and her heart in her throat, and all the silence of a Texas August pressing down on both of them. "You had no right," he said again, but this time his voice came out differently, not like gravel. More like something that had been gravel once and had been worn down to something finer by water that kept coming at it. "I know," she said honestly. "I did it anyway." He turned around. His face was a landscape she could not read, mountains and valleys of an emotion that had no single name. "Why?" he said, and that she noticed was a question. "Because you were going to lose everything your father built," she said. "Because I have seen you work this county for 9 months and I have never once seen you rest. Because you went to Tom Pruitt's house and asked for his son, but you would never ask anyone for your own sake." She paused, and because it would have been a waste. A waste. His jaw tightened. "You spent your savings to prevent a waste. I spent my savings to prevent a catastrophe. Miss Keene." He stepped toward her and she held the deed out to him. He looked at it like it was something that might burn him. He took it. His fingers brushed hers in the exchange and she felt that touch move all the way up her arm. "Do you have any understanding of what this does to a man?" "Which part?" she asked quietly. "Being saved by someone who didn't ask permission." He looked down at the deed. His thumb ran across the edge of it slowly. "Being in debt to a woman who," he stopped himself. "A woman who what?" She pressed because she was not made of the kind of material that let important things hang unfinished. He looked up at her. Those dark, deep-set eyes. That jaw. The dust on his collar from whatever work he had been doing before she rode up, because Milton Hadley worked from sunup to sundown 7 days a week and had never once let a sun rise on an idle ranch. He looked at her and she watched him struggle with something large and tangled and old. "A woman I have feelings for," he said. The words came out like they cost him everything he had. "A woman I cannot accept charity from." The air between them changed. "It isn't charity," Mabel said carefully. "There's a promissory note. One you know I may not be able to repay for years. One that carries no interest and no penalty." Mabel, her first name in his mouth. It was the first time he had ever said it. "That is charity dressed in paper." She took a breath. "Then let it be," she said. "Let it be what it is. You would have lost this land. You would have left Colton with nothing. And I couldn't." She stopped, and then she finished it because she believed in finishing things. "I could not watch that happen and do nothing when I had the means to prevent it." "Because you have feelings for me," he said. He was watching her closely, reading her the way she suspected he read weather, looking for the real pattern under the visible surface. "Yes," she said, "because I have feelings for you." He looked at the deed again. He looked at the land beyond her, the rolling grass going gold in the August heat, the fence posts he had set himself, the barn his father had built in 1862, the house he had been born in. He looked at all of it and she could see him absorbing what it meant that it was still his. "I owe you a debt I don't know how to carry," he said finally. "Then don't carry it," she said. "Do something better with it." He looked at her. What? She was not going to say it for him. She had saved his ranch. She was not going to save this too. The silence stretched for 5 whole seconds, which is a very long time in the presence of feelings this size. "Have dinner with me," Milton Hadley said. "Tonight." It was not much, but from a man who had not asked for a single thing in years, it was enormous. "Yes," she said. He nodded once, tight and controlled, like a man who had just made a decision he understood was permanent. Then he looked down at the deed one more time, and she watched something loosen in his face just fractionally, like the first crack appearing in ice that has been frozen a very long time. He stepped back from the doorway, and she stepped inside the house for the first time, and neither of them said anything more for a moment. She looked around the main room. It was spare and clean, the way a man's room is clean when he has nothing left to spend on comfort but refuses to let it be dirty. There was a stone fireplace with a photograph on the mantel. She moved toward it without entirely meaning to. It was a daguerreotype of a man and a woman. The man had Milton's jawline and his height. The woman was small and fine-featured with an expression of calm strength that Mabel recognized as the expression of a person who has survived a great deal and found peace with it. "Your parents," Mabel said. "Yes," Milton said. He had followed her to the fireplace and was standing slightly behind her, close enough that she was aware of the warmth of him. "My father came to Texas when most people thought Georgia was a safer prospect. He was brave. He was restless," Milton said, with the particular tone of a son who has had many years to understand the man his father was, but it amounted to the same thing. "And your mother, she came with him." A pause. "She always said that was the bravest thing she ever did." Mabel looked at the photograph for another moment. Then she turned and he was very close. She had not quite calculated how close. They were nearly the same height that way, nearly eye to eye, and he smelled of leather and hay and the particular clean sweat of hard outdoor work, and the look on his face had shifted from the landscape of conflict to something quieter and more dangerous. "I have a confession," he said. "Tell me." "I knew something was wrong in October," he said. "With the finances. When the cattle losses came in after the freeze, I knew then that I was behind in a way that might not be recoverable. He looked steadily at her. I should have made different choices. I should have sought different solutions. I chose instead to keep working and keep hoping and not tell anyone. Why? Because this ranch is what my father left me, he said simply. And asking for help would have meant admitting that I wasn't enough to hold it. Mabel absorbed that. The particular dark logic of pride, the hidden belief underneath the surface conviction, the one that says I am only worth what I can do alone. She had seen that belief in students, in adults, in herself, when she had refused to ask the county school board for additional funding because she feared they would see it as evidence of failure. "You are enough," she said quietly. "The drought and the freeze and the cattle sickness are not evidence of your inadequacy. They are evidence of an exceptionally difficult year." He looked at her for a long moment. "You have a particular talent," he said, "for saying the thing that goes directly to the center of something. It's useful in a classroom," she said. Something happened in the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile. The beginning of one, perhaps, the idea of one. "I'll have supper on by 7, he said. She stayed for supper. He cooked beans and salt pork and cornbread, which was a modest meal, but he made it without apology and without comment, and she ate it at his kitchen table, and they talked for 3 hours. They talked about his father and her father. They talked about what she had taught in San Antonio versus what she was teaching in Colton, the difference in what children knew and how they learned it. They talked about the county, about the Prewitt family, about the drought cycles in the hill country, and the way certain years the cedar took over and certain years the grass came back strong. He talked more than she had ever heard him talk. Something had broken open, she thought. Not his pride exactly, but the container around it. The sealed, waterproof vessel he had built to keep his actual self contained and dry. She left at 9 o'clock because propriety required it, and also because she had a ride of 14 miles to make and she preferred to cover ground before it got fully dark. He walked her to her horse, a steady gray mare named Fern, and he held the horse's head while she mounted. "Mabel," he said when she had her foot in the stirrup and was settled in the saddle. She looked down at him. "Thank you," he said. It was the plainest 2 words she had ever heard, completely unadorned, completely true. "You're welcome, Milton," she said. She rode home through the warm dark, and by the time she reached Colton and put Fern in the small stable behind her house, she was so full of something she could not name that she stood for a moment with her forehead against the mare's neck and breathed. He came to town the following Saturday for his usual first Saturday round at the Silver Spur, but he did not stay at the saloon long. He came to her door at 7 in the evening with his hat in his hands and a bunch of late summer prairie flowers, brown-eyed Susans and goldenrod, tied with a piece of leather cord, and asked if she would take a walk with him. They walked through town and out past the church and along the creek, and he talked to her about his plans. He had a plan now, a real one, not the grim, hopeful endurance he had been practicing before, but an actual plan with a logical sequence and a set of goals. He was going to sell enough cattle in the fall to build up his working capital. He was going to approach a rancher in the next county about a breeding arrangement for the spring. He was going to hire 1 additional hand for the cattle drive season. She listened and asked questions and felt something warm and specifically located pressing against the inside of her sternum. "You've thought all this through," she said. "I've had 3 days to think," he said. "With the immediate catastrophe removed, I can actually think." "And you're not angry with me anymore?" she asked, because she believed in asking the actual question. He stopped walking. They were along the creek out of sight of the town, cottonwoods making a murmur overhead in the slight evening breeze. He turned to face her. "I was never angry with you," he said. "I was angry with myself, for letting it get so far that someone else had to." He stopped. "That you had to do what you did." "I wanted to," she said. "I know." He was looking at her very directly, the way he did when he was being most serious. "That might be the part I am struggling with the most." "Why?" "Because no one has ever wanted to do something like that for me," he said. "I don't entirely know what to do with it. You could let it simply be true, she said, without needing to balance it or resolve it or carry it as a debt. I'm not sure I know how to do that. I think, she said carefully, that is something you might learn, if you chose to. He looked at her in the cottonwood dark, the creek running nearby with its soft, persistent sound, and the beginning of that smile came back, further along this time, closer to being an actual smile. I'm going to court you properly, he said, if you're willing. I am willing, she said, and he nodded, and they walked back to town in a silence that was entirely different from the silence that had sat between them in the doorway 3 days ago. This silence was full. This silence was like the sky after a good rain, still and clear and deeply, essentially clean. He courted her properly. He came to town every Saturday and some Wednesday evenings. He brought her books from the general store when the supply wagon came through. A novel by Thomas Hardy in September. A volume of poetry in October that he said he had not read himself but thought she might like, and which turned out to be exactly right. He took her to church every Sunday when his work schedule permitted and sat beside her in the 3rd pew, which meant she moved from the 5th. And this was noted by everyone in the congregation in the particular way small towns note these things, with satisfaction and small smiles and whispered conversations that were not entirely whispers. In October, he came to the schoolroom after hours again, not about Danny Prewitt this time, but just to see her. He stood in the doorway the same way he had the first time, hat in both hands, and she looked up from her papers and felt the same jolt she had felt that January afternoon, only deeper now, because she knew so much more about what was inside that careful, contained, sun-weathered man. I've been thinking, he said, about what my father would have said. He came into the room and sat down in one of the student chairs, which was slightly too small for him in a way that was unexpectedly endearing. He would have said I was a fool for nearly losing it. Maybe. He also would have said he paused. He used to tell me when I was a boy and too proud to accept help from the neighboring ranch hands when a task was beyond me, he said, Milton, a man who cannot receive help cannot truly give it either. I thought that was nonsense when I was 12. And now I think he was trying to tell me something about what it costs to be alone by choice, he said. He looked at her. I have been alone by choice for a long time. She set down her pen. Since your father died. Since before that, he said quietly. My mother died when I was 17. My father and I, we worked well together. We didn't talk much about the feelings of things. We just worked. He turned his hat brim in his hands, one slow revolution. When he died, I didn't know how to grieve out loud because I'd never done it, so I just kept working. Mabel was quiet for a moment, holding the weight of that with care. That must have been very lonely, she said finally. I didn't know it was, he said, until recently. She understood what recently meant. She understood it the way you understand things that have been named without being spoken directly. Milton, she said. He looked at her. What you're describing, what you're telling me right now, the things about your mother and your father and working alone and your pride, she said carefully, this is the part you don't have to carry alone anymore, if you don't want to. He was quiet for a long moment. The autumn light came through the school windows at a slant and caught the dust motes in the air between them and made everything amber and slow. I don't want to, he said. She smiled, and he smiled back. And it was the first full, uncomplicated, unguarded smile she had ever seen on his face, and it changed him entirely, and she fell about 6 more layers into love with him, all at once, fast and certain, the way creeks rise when the water finally decides to come. November arrived, and with it the cattle drive preparation, and Milton was consumed with work in the way that ranch work consumed people in that season, entirely and without apology. But he wrote her letters. She had not expected that. He was not a man she had imagined as a writer of letters, but he wrote them in a plain, direct hand, and sent them with Danny Prewitt, who made the ride between the ranch and town regularly, and seemed to take enormous pleasure in this role of unofficial courier. The letters were not flowery. They were not the kind of letters women in the novels she read received, full of elaborate metaphor and dramatic declarations. They were his letters, which meant they were exact and honest and said precisely what they meant with very little decoration. One letter in particular she kept folded in the front of her journal. It said, "Mabel, the cattle drive returns next week and I have been thinking, out here in the evenings after the work is done, about what it would be to come home not to an empty house but to something different. I have been thinking about the way you ask questions when other people would accept silence. I have been thinking about how the schoolroom looked with you in it, that first Tuesday, and how I thought, without meaning to think it, that this is a woman who would make the world make more sense. I think that is still true. I hope to see you when I return. Milton." She read that letter enough times that the fold lines became soft as cloth. He returned from the cattle drive in late November, leaner and trail-worn, and with enough from the sale to be standing on genuinely solid ground for the first time in 2 years. He came to her door the evening of his return, still dusty from the road. "I'm not fit company," he said. "I should have cleaned up first." "Come in," she said. "I'll make coffee." He sat at her kitchen table, which was a much smaller and more chaotic table than his, covered in student papers and her own books, and she made coffee on her small stove and brought it to him, and he wrapped both hands around the mug and looked at her with the particular expression she had learned to read as the one he wore when he was about to say something that cost him. "The drive was good," he said. "We got good prices. I'm going to be all right." "I know you are," she said. "I am going to start repaying you," he said. "In the spring, when the breeding arrangement comes through and I have—" "Milton," she said. He stopped. "I don't need you to repay me." "Mabel." "Not because I don't think you capable," she said, "but because I didn't give you that money as an investment. I gave it because she stopped, and then she looked at him directly, and she said it plainly because she was a person who believed in plain speech. I gave it because I love you." The kitchen was very still. "I have loved you," she continued, because she had started and she was going to finish, "since somewhere around March, when you danced with me at the spring social and looked at my face the whole time like you were memorizing it, and then walked me to the edge of the room and said good night and left, and I stood there and thought, that is a man worth knowing." Milton Hadley set down his coffee mug. He stood up from the table, and she stood up too because she was not going to be sitting down for whatever came next. He came around the table and he was in front of her, and he took her face in both his hands, large and careful and warm, and he looked at her with those deep-set eyes that were full, so full. "Mabel Keene," he said, "I have loved you since the day you told me that Tom Prewitt's son would get extra time and that we would call it standard practice. Because only a woman who understands the precise nature of human pride would know to do it that way." She felt her throat tighten with something that was not sorrow. "Marry me," he said. "Not because of the deed or the debt or because I owe you anything, because you are the only person in my life who has ever simply seen me, and I would very much like to spend the rest of my life learning to see you back." There were so many things she could have said. She chose the simplest one. "Yes," she said. He kissed her. It was not an uncertain kiss. It was not the kiss of a man who had not thought about this moment. It was precise and warm and deeply felt, like all the things about him that she had come to love, and she put her hands against the front of his dusty shirt and kissed him back with everything she had. And outside the small window of her kitchen house, the November stars were out in their full force, thick and cold and blazing, over the hill country of Texas. They were married in the Colton Community Church on a bright Saturday in January of 1884, exactly 1 year and 1 week after the January Tuesday when he had appeared in her schoolroom doorway with his hat in his hands. The ceremony was performed by Reverend Aldous Crane, who had an enthusiastic fondness for performing weddings for people he had watched falling in love in his congregation, and who put particular feeling into the vows. The church was full. Colton County turned out for weddings the way it turned out for nothing else, because weddings in small frontier towns were communal events, evidence that life was continuing, and love was still a viable enterprise even out on the edge of a territory that had not entirely decided to be civilized yet. The Pruitt family was there, Tom Pruitt shaking Milton's hand with an awkward firmness that communicated more than words. The schoolchildren were there in a cluster near the back, having been let out of their Friday lessons early for the occasion, Danny Pruitt among them, looking extremely important. Gerald Holt had come up from San Antonio, the only person present who knew the full detail of what Mabel had done, and he stood near the back in a good suit and looked satisfied in the way that people look when a thing they helped arrange works out well. Mabel wore a dress she had made herself from fabric she had ordered from San Antonio, a deep blue that came close to the color of the evening sky, with fitted sleeves and a simple cut that suited her height and her particular kind of beauty, which was the kind that did not bother with ornamentation because it did not need it. She carried a small spray of dried wildflowers and pine from the hill country, because it was January and fresh flowers were not available, and the dried ones smelled of summer and warm air, and everything she had felt the first time she rode out to that ranch and saw what it was that she was saving. Milton wore his best suit, which was a dark charcoal gray that she had never seen him in before, and he stood at the front of the church and watched her come down the aisle with an expression that was openly, entirely, unguardedly full of love, all his carefully maintained composure entirely suspended for the occasion. And she walked toward him and felt something settle in her like the last piece of something long complicated clicking finally into its right position. After the ceremony, the town held a celebration in the church hall. There was food brought by every household in Colton, great covered dishes of beans and cornbread and roasted meat and pies, and someone brought a fiddle, and someone else brought a banjo, and the dancing went on until 10 o'clock when Reverend Crane declared that God had probably seen enough for one day, and everybody laughed and went home. Milton and Mabel Hadley drove out to the ranch in a wagon under a cold, clear sky bright with stars, their breath making small clouds in the January air, her shoulder pressed against his arm around her against the cold. "Well," he said. "Well," she agreed. "There's a thing I want to say," he said. "Say it." He was quiet for a moment, the horses' hooves steady on the packed dirt road, the grassland silver-gray around them in the starlight. "When I was standing at the church today, watching you come down the aisle," he said, "I thought about the morning you came to the ranch with that deed, and I thought about how angry I was. And then I thought about how I stood there at that doorframe and felt something break open inside me, because you had done the thing I could not do, and you had done it because you loved me, and everything I had been holding so tightly was just," he paused, "released, and I didn't know what to do with that. I still don't, entirely, but I know that I want to learn." She tucked her head against his shoulder. "We'll learn it together," she said. He pressed his mouth to the top of her head. "Together," he said, like a word he was just now learning the real meaning of. The ranch house was cold when they arrived, but Milton had banked the fire before they left for the church, and it came back quickly, throwing orange light across the main room. She stood in front of the fireplace, warming her hands, and looked at the photograph of his parents on the mantel. "Do you think they would have liked me?" she asked. He came to stand beside her. He looked at the photograph for a moment. "My mother would have loved you," he said. "She respected women who knew what they wanted and went after it." He paused. "My father would have taken considerably longer. He had a very specific idea of what a suitable wife looked like, and it didn't involve the wife in question secretly paying off the mortgage." Mabel laughed, a real laugh, deep and warm. "Noted." "But," Milton said, with that almost smile that had become, by now, an actual frequent smile, "he would have come around. He appreciated competence above almost everything else." "And you," she said, turning to look at him. He looked back at her fully, the firelight doing something beautiful to his face. "I am already completely converted," he said. "I was converted the minute you rode up to this house with that deed in your hand. Even when I was furious with you, I was—" he shook his head slightly. "Moved doesn't cover it. I was changed." She stepped toward him and put her arms around him, and he put his around her, and they stood in front of the firelight with the photograph of his parents above them and the Texas night outside, and it was a moment so complete that it needed nothing added to it. The first spring on the ranch as a married couple was a revelation to both of them. Mabel had grown up in town, had always lived in towns, and the particular daily rhythm of ranch life, its absolute dependence on the land and the weather and the animals, was something she had understood intellectually but had not experienced in the body. She found that she loved it. She loved waking before dawn and seeing the sky shift from black to deep blue to the first pale gold at the horizon. She loved the cattle, their extraordinary stupidity and their occasional dignity. She loved the physicality of it, mending fences, feeding animals, helping in ways that were practical and immediate and satisfying in a way that intellectual work sometimes wasn't. She did not stop teaching. She had asked Milton about this before the wedding, directly and clearly, because she had not been willing to enter a marriage where this was assumed rather than discussed. He had looked at her with genuine puzzlement and said, "Of course you'll keep teaching. You're a good teacher. Why would you stop?" And she had felt such a rush of gratitude for the simplicity of that, for the complete absence of any sense that her work was a threat or an inconvenience, that she had kissed him on the spot, which had surprised and then very much pleased him. She taught 4 days a week through the spring, making the 14-mile ride to Colton on Fern and back, and on Fridays she stayed on the ranch and worked alongside Milton and the 2 ranch hands, Jake Eller and young Pete Morse, who had been hired in February and who treated Mabel with a respectful wariness that gradually became genuine liking, as they realized she was not going to complicate the working environment or coddle anyone. The breeding arrangement Milton had negotiated in the winter came through in March, and the new cattle were excellent quality, strong-boned and well-tempered. Milton was up before anyone most days, and Mabel would wake and lie in the warm dark and listen to him moving quietly through the house, getting dressed, not wanting to wake her, and she felt that particular variety of love that is made of small, repeated, careful gestures rather than large declarations. She did, occasionally, catch him in the old habits. There was a Tuesday in April when he spent 3 hours trying to fix a broken section of the windmill by himself when 2 people could have done it in 40 minutes, and she rode up and watched him for a full 10 minutes, standing in the warm spring wind with her arms folded, until he finally saw her and stopped. "I was managing," he said. "You were managing," she agreed, "in the same way a man manages to cross a river by climbing a tree rather than using the bridge." He looked at her, that jaw, that deep brown gaze. Then he said, "I'll admit the bridge is faster." "I'll hold the piece while you tighten the bolt," she said. They fixed it in 40 minutes. He thanked her without being asked. It was a small thing, but she logged it in her private accounting of their marriage as significant. He was learning. He was genuinely, effortfully learning, and she loved him for the effort as much as for the result. In May, she told him she was pregnant. She told him at the kitchen table after supper, with a directness that she had applied to every other important piece of information she had ever delivered. He looked at her for a moment, processing, and then something happened in his face that she had never quite seen before. It was not the almost smile or even the full smile she had come to know. It was something deeper and more private, something that came from a place that had not been accessed in a very long time. He got up from his chair and came to her and lifted her hand from the table and held it in both of his carefully like something precious. "A child," he said. "In December, I think," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "A child," he said again, like the word required 2 attempts to fully settle. "You're happy," she said. "I am." He stopped. He tried again. "I have not allowed myself to want this," he said carefully. "When I thought I was losing the ranch, I stopped letting myself imagine a future that included family, children. I put it away somewhere because it was too large a loss to carry alongside everything else. And now." He brought her hand to his mouth and pressed his lips against it, and she felt the warmth of that all the way through her. "Now," he said, "I am going to need to take all of it back out again, everything I put away." She squeezed his hand. "Take your time," she said. "December," he said. He said it like a man marking a date on the calendar of his heart. The summer of 1884 passed in the particular amber warmth that the Texas hill country produced in its best seasons, when the grass was tall and the creek ran, and the sky was a blue so complete it seemed to have no edges. Mabel taught until September, when the physical demands of late pregnancy made the 14-mile daily ride unwise, and took a temporary leave that the Colton School Board granted with zero complications, largely because they could not afford to lose her and knew it. She spent the last months on the ranch, sewing and reading and helping where she could and learning from Milton, who turned out to have a considerable store of practical domestic knowledge from years of living alone, how to do various things she had never needed to do for herself, how to put up preserves, how to repair a cook stove flue, how to read the particular color of clouds that meant a dangerous front was building in the west. They spent those evenings on the porch in the cooling air, her in the rocker his mother had left behind, him in the straight-back chair he had made the previous winter, and they talked and were quiet in alternating rhythms that had developed their own natural cadence, like a song you learn by playing it until it belongs to you. He told her more in those evenings than he had told anyone. He told her about his mother's illness and how he had not understood what was happening until it was very nearly over. He told her about the years after she died, when he and his father had existed in a kind of functional silence around their grief. He told her about a girl in his youth, a girl from a neighboring ranch who he had thought he loved and who had eventually married a merchant from Austin, and how he had decided after that to put the emotional part of himself somewhere out of reach for safekeeping. "And then you came into the schoolroom," Mabel said. "And then you came into the schoolroom," he agreed, "and disrupted everything." "Very thoroughly," he said. She looked at him sideways in the porch light. "Are you grateful for that?" He turned to look at her, and the look was so clear and so full and so openly certain that she felt it land in her chest like something coming home. "Mabel," he said, "you saved my ranch, my land, the thing my father built and I was failing to hold. That alone would be enough to owe you gratitude for every remaining day of my life." She started to say it was not about gratitude, but he was not finished. "But you also," he said, "came to me with your love like it was the most natural thing in the world to give it. You did not expect me to already be whole before you offered it. You did not need me to have everything in order." He paused. "You just came and you stayed, and you treated the broken pieces as though they were ordinary and workable. And eventually he stopped, and the smile came, full and unguarded. Eventually I started to believe that they were." She was not going to cry because she generally found crying in public, even very private public, to be more dramatic than she preferred, but her throat did something complicated and she reached across and put her hand on his arm and left it there. "You were never broken," she said. "You were a man under enormous pressure without sufficient support. There's a very large difference." He covered her hand with his. "You are," he said, "the most precise person I have ever known." "It's useful in a classroom," she said, for the second time in their acquaintance, and he laughed, and it was the best sound she had ever heard in her life. Their son was born on the 14th of December, 1884, in the Hadley Ranch house, with the help of the Colton midwife, Mrs. Bertie Falk, who was a small and commanding woman with 40 years of births behind her, and an absolute zero tolerance for unnecessary drama. The birth was not easy, as births rarely were in those times, but it was not the kind of catastrophe that the era was also capable of producing, and by 3 in the morning on December 15th, Mabel was lying in the bedroom with a clean quilt over her and a son in her arms. Milton came in when Mrs. Falk allowed it. He stood in the doorway, which was a doorway he had stood in before, on a very different occasion and for very different reasons, and he looked at his wife and his son with an expression that had no name in any language Mabel knew. He sat beside the bed and looked at the baby, who was wrinkled and red and making small, indignant noises about the state of things. "He's angry already," Milton said quietly. "He gets that from his father," Mabel said, and Milton made a sound that was half laugh and half something too big for laughing. "What do we name him?" Milton asked. They had discussed names through the autumn but had arrived at no firm conclusion. She looked at the baby, then at Milton. "Thomas," she said, "for your father." He was quiet for a moment. "Thomas," he said. "Thomas Milton Hadley," she said, "unless you have a strong objection." He did not have a strong objection. He reached out and very carefully, with the large hands that could set fence posts and repair windmills and hold her face in the dark, he touched his son's head, just the tips of his fingers. "Thomas," he said softly. The baby made a noise that was not quite in response, but that both of them decided to take as acceptance of the name. The winter passed. Thomas Hadley grew from an indignant red creature into a plump, serious-faced infant, who observed the world with large dark eyes exactly like his father's, and a stubbornness about his feeding schedule that was exactly like his mother's. By spring he was recognizably himself, a person with opinions about things, which Milton found both bewildering and wonderful, not having had much experience of small people. Mabel went back to teaching in February, leaving Thomas in the care of Mrs. Falk, who had taken a particular shine to the Hadley family and came to the ranch 3 days a week in a professional capacity that was somewhere between nurse and grandmother. Milton had suggested, with very careful phrasing, that Mabel did not need to return to teaching so soon if she preferred to remain on the ranch, and Mabel had looked at him with the particular fond patience of a woman who knows her husband means well and is also slightly wrong. "I need to go back," she had said simply. "Not because of money. Because I am a teacher and the children need their teacher, and I am not the kind of person who becomes complete by staying home." He had received this information with his characteristic square-jawed consideration and then said, "Fair enough, but you should take the wagon. The road is icy in February, and Fern is not a fan of icy roads." "That's a very reasonable compromise," she said. "I've been practicing," he said. She kissed him quickly and warmly. He looked pleased in the particular way he looked pleased when he had managed to be useful without overstepping, which was the particular balance they had worked out together over their year of marriage, and which they were both still working on and which, she suspected, they would be working on for the rest of their lives, and that seemed entirely right. The ranch grew through 1885. The breeding arrangement produced a strong spring crop of calves, and the cattle sale in the fall of that year was the best Milton had seen since his father's time. He hired a third hand, a young man named Alejandro Garza, who had come up from south of the Rio Grande, and was one of the finest horsemen any of them had ever seen. Alejandro became quickly indispensable, and also became Thomas Hadley's first hero, which Milton accepted with great grace and only minimal jealousy. The promissory note, the one Mabel had created through Gerald Holt's legal arrangement, sat in a locked box in the ranch house. Milton had transferred a sum of money to Mabel's bank account in San Antonio in the fall of 1884, representing roughly half the original amount. She had not asked him to. He had not told her in advance. He had simply shown her the bank receipt and said, "I know you said it wasn't necessary. I know the note is unenforceable. This isn't about the note." "Then what's it about?" she had asked. "Partnership," he said. "You gave me something enormous. I want to give back something of equivalent weight, not to balance a ledger but because," he found the words with the particular effort she had learned to recognize as his version of speaking from the deepest honest place. "Because this ranch belongs to both of us now, and that means its financial health belongs to both of us, and what you gave to it was not a gift from outside but a contribution from inside." She had looked at him for a long time. "You have come very far," she said softly. He raised an eyebrow. "From where?" "From the man who told me I had no right." He was quiet for a moment, then with a wry turn to his mouth, "I was deeply wrong about that." "You were frightened," she corrected, "which is different from wrong." "You are always making these distinctions," he said. "Someone has to," she said. By the spring of 1886, Colton had grown considerably. The railroad had extended a spur line to the edge of the county, which brought new settlers and new commerce, and a great deal of dust and noise and argument about property lines. The Hadley Ranch sat in a particularly desirable location relative to the new rail access, and there had been 2 or 3 approaches from land speculators, whose names Milton had not bothered to remember because his answer was always the same. "It's not for sale," he said to each of them, with a finality that communicated very clearly that this was the only conversation they would be having on the subject. Mabel, who was present for one of these conversations, watched the speculator leave and then turned to Milton. "He'll be back. He can come back as many times as he likes," Milton said. "The answer won't change." "What if they come with a less polite approach?" she said. "There have been incidents in other counties, ranchers being pressured." He looked at her steadily. "Are you worried?" "I'm practical," she said, "which you know. I'm saying we should be aware of the possibility." He nodded slowly. "Noted," he said. "I'll speak to the county sheriff." "Good," she said. "And I'll write to Gerald Holt about ensuring all the land documents are in perfect order." He looked at her with a particular expression that she had come to categorize as admiring exasperation. "You've already been thinking about this." "For approximately a week," she confirmed. "When were you going to tell me?" "I was waiting to see if you would get there yourself," she said pleasantly. He made a sound. "You test me." "Occasionally," she agreed. "You generally pass." He did, in fact, speak to the county sheriff, a capable man named Hector Dunbar who had been in the position for 3 years and who took the information seriously and quietly, and increased his patrol frequency in the Hadley area for the following 2 months. The speculators, whoever was behind them, did not escalate beyond the polite approach. Whether this was due to the sheriff's attention or simply the clear impenetrability of Milton Hadley's resolve, they eventually moved their interest to a different set of properties. Mabel's letter to Gerald Holt resulted in a thorough legal review of all the Hadley Ranch documentation, which turned up one minor discrepancy in a property boundary description that had existed since Thomas Hadley's original deed in 1861, and which was corrected quietly and permanently. Gerald Holt had written back that he was very glad they had checked, and that this type of clerical error was precisely the sort of thing land speculators' lawyers went hunting for when they wanted to create legal uncertainty around a title. Mabel had shown Milton that letter over breakfast, and he had read it with a jaw that went progressively more rigid, and then set the letter down and said, "Thank you for writing to Gerald, for being the kind of person who writes to Gerald before there's a crisis," he said, rather than after. She poured him more coffee. "You're welcome," she said. He reached across the table and took her hand briefly but deliberately. "I mean it," he said. "I know," she said. "You always do." Thomas Hadley turned 2 in December of 1886, walking now and talking in the incomplete and extremely confident way of 2-year-olds, and having developed a particular passion for the horses and a dislike of being indoors that suggested he was going to be a rancher whether anyone planned it for him or not. Milton spent Saturday afternoons teaching him to sit on the back of the most gentle of the ranch horses, holding him carefully, walking slow circles in the yard, and Mabel sat on the porch steps and watched her husband and her son in the afternoon light and felt the particular fullness of a life that had settled into what it was supposed to be. She was pregnant again. She had not told Milton yet. She was turning it over in herself first, the way she turned large things over before she presented them, making sure she understood what she felt before she asked anyone else to engage with it. What she felt was uncomplicated happiness, which was its own revelation, given that uncomplicated happiness had not always been easy to come by. It felt like something that had been planted and tended and had finally, definitively, taken root. She told him that evening. He was at the kitchen table with account books, because it was the time of year for account books, and he looked up when she sat down across from him and said, "I have something to tell you," and she watched his face cycle through a rapid series of expressions before settling on the question. "Another child," she said. He closed the account book. He looked at her with the expression she had seen when Thomas was born, the one that had no name. When? July, I think. He got up from the chair and came around the table and did not take her hand this time but put his arms around her from behind, his cheek against the side of her head, a gesture so different from his usual careful consideration that she was surprised and then not surprised, because she knew by now how much lived in him that did not always get out. "A summer child," he said. "Yes, Thomas will be jealous," he said, with a tone that suggested he found this only slightly concerning and mostly amusing. "Thomas will adapt," she said. "He is adaptable. He gets that from both of us." She felt his breath against her hair. "Mabel," he said. "Yes, I think about that morning sometimes," he said. "The morning you came to the ranch with the deed, I think about what I said to you." "You were shocked," she said. "I was terrible," he said plainly. "I told you that you had no right." "You weren't entirely wrong," she said. "I didn't ask." "You saved everything I had," he said. "And I stood there in my own doorway and told you that you had no right." He paused. "I have thought about that a great deal. What do you think about it?" He was quiet for a moment. "I think that was the moment I understood something I had never quite grasped before," he said. "That accepting love is not the same as surrendering pride. That someone doing something enormous for you is not an indictment of your worth. I had always believed, somewhere underneath everything, that needing help meant being less." He stopped. "You stood in that doorway and told me you loved me with a deed in your hand, and I was furious at you for it. And underneath the fury I was," he found the word carefully, "undone, because you had seen the thing I was most ashamed of and you had not turned away from it. You had run toward it." Mabel turned in his arms so she could see his face. "I ran toward you," she said, "not toward the problem." He looked at her. "I know that now," he said. "I knew it then too, somewhere underneath the pride. It just took me a while to let myself know it." She kissed him slowly and completely, with her hands on either side of his face, and he kissed her back the same way. And it was not a young couple's first desperate kiss, but something with years in it, with texture and history, with all the particular weight of people who have chosen each other repeatedly, and with full knowledge. The summer child was a girl, born in late July of 1887, in the same bedroom where Thomas had been born, with Mrs. Falk in attendance again, and the summer air coming through the open window carrying the smell of dry grass and cedar. They named her Clara, after Mabel's mother, and she arrived with red hair that stunned both of them. A genetic surprise that Mrs. Falk said was sometimes how it went when you had certain combinations of ancestry, and which delighted Mabel and bewildered Milton in the endearing way that red hair on a daughter apparently bewildered dark-haired fathers. Thomas was not entirely sure about Clara for the first several weeks, but came around, as Mabel had predicted, and by autumn was treating her with a proprietary protectiveness that suggested he had decided she was his to look after, which was, she thought, perhaps the most Hadley thing he could have done. The following years wove themselves into the fabric of the ranch and the town and the county. Mabel taught school until 1889, when the school board offered her the position of school superintendent for the district, a newly created role that came with a broader mandate and a salary that made the position almost comically valuable given the school board's general financial caution. She accepted it and spent the next several years traveling the county, establishing new schools in communities that were growing up around the railroad, hiring teachers, and creating the kind of educational infrastructure that made a territory into a real place where people chose to build futures. Milton observed her work with the particular pride of a man who has learned to take genuine pleasure in a partner's independent excellence, rather than feeling obscured by it. He was not a man who needed to be the most capable person in any room, had never actually been that, though he had wasted several years operating as though he did. He was a man who did his work with complete dedication and loved his family with complete dedication, and had discovered, in his 30s, that complete dedication divided between two meaningful things was not less of either but somehow more of both. The ranch became what his father had always envisioned it could be, a genuine working cattle operation of real size, respected in the county for the quality of its animals and the reliability of its operation. Milton hired well and treated his hands fairly, which in the Texas of the 1880s was not universal practice, and was a conscious choice that he made deliberately, having watched what happened to operations that ran on fear rather than respect. Alejandro Garza became the ranch foreman in 1888 and proved to be an extraordinarily capable one, bringing both technical skill and a natural authority that the other hands responded well to. He also became, over those years, genuinely part of the Hadley family in the way that matters, present at important occasions, consulted on ranch decisions, treated with the full human dignity that he was owed, and that was sometimes uncomfortably withheld from men of his background in that part of Texas at that time. Milton and Mabel held this position deliberately and without performance, because it was simply correct, and the ranch was better for it in every measurable way. Clara Hadley grew up with red hair and her mother's green eyes and her father's jaw, which on a small girl was both slightly unfortunate and absolutely formidable, and she had opinions about everything from a very early age. Thomas Hadley grew up steady and quiet and perceptive, more like his father in temperament, and took to ranch work with an ease that suggested it was simply the natural expression of who he was. In 1892, Mabel turned 35, and the county held a dinner in her honor for her work establishing 7 new schools in a decade, and Milton sat at the head table beside her in the good suit he had worn at their wedding, which still fit, because Milton Hadley was a man who worked physically every day and did not tend toward softness, and he listened to the county commissioner deliver a speech about Mabel's contributions, and he looked at her, and she looked at him. And the look contained everything, their whole history, the deed on a hot August morning, the dinner by lamplight, the letters sent with Danny Pruitt, the first smile, the first kiss. Thomas's dark eyes and Clara's red hair and 10 years of porches and kitchen tables and learning and growing and choosing each other over and over in all the small ways that add up to a life. She reached under the table and took his hand. He held it. After the dinner, driving home in the wagon under a September sky bright with stars, he said, "I am very proud of you." "I know," she said. "I don't say that enough," he said. "You say it correctly when you say it," she said. "That's what matters." He was quiet for a comfortable distance. "Are you happy?" he asked, not anxiously, simply sincerely, the way he asked things when he wanted the actual answer. She thought about the question the way she thought about important questions, with full, honest attention. She thought about the ranch and the school and Thomas and Clara and the 10 years of mornings and evenings and all the particular texture of a life that was both ordinary and entirely chosen. "Profoundly," she said. "Are you?" He looked at the road ahead, the horses' ears moving in the dark, the familiar land rolling away on both sides under the stars. "I think I was happy before I knew I was," he said. "The day you came to that ranch house, even in the middle of all that conflict he paused. I knew something was beginning, something I hadn't expected. Something that was going to change the whole shape of everything." "And has it?" she asked. He turned to look at her, and the stars were bright enough to see by, and his face was clear and open in the way it was now, the way it had taken years and trust and love and learning to become. "It has changed the shape of everything," he said, "into something I could not have imagined." He paused. "Something better than I knew how to want." She leaned against his shoulder. He adjusted his arm around her. They drove home through the warm Texas September night, and behind them the lights of Colton faded, and ahead of them the dark shape of the ranch came into view, the house and the barn and the fence lines, all the things his father had built and he had nearly lost, and she had saved without being asked, all of it standing solid and permanent under the enormous sky. In the spring of 1893, Mabel discovered she was pregnant for the 3rd time, which came as a genuine surprise to both of them, not unwelcome but unexpected, and which produced a discussion at the kitchen table that went in 17 directions simultaneously before arriving at the mutual conclusion that this was wonderful and also slightly chaotic, and they would manage both of those things together, as they managed everything. Thomas was 8. Clara was 5. A new baby would be a considerable adjustment. They made the adjustment with the combination of practical planning and open feeling that had come to characterize how the Hadleys did most things. And in December of 1893, exactly 9 years after Thomas had come into the world, a second son arrived. They named him George, which was a name they had simply both liked without any particular historical significance. And George Hadley arrived in the world with an immediately sunny and sociable disposition that was distinct from both his siblings and from both his parents, and which Mrs. Falk, now in her 60s, and having delivered the third Hadley child with what she described as a professional satisfaction bordering on pride, said simply indicated that he was his own person already. "He gets that from himself," Milton observed, looking at his second son. "The best kind," Mabel said. The Hadley ranch entered the 20th century in good order. Thomas Hadley was 16 in 1900, and already working the ranch with the full capability of a grown man, though Mabel kept a firm hand on his education and required him to attend the Colton school through its full term regardless of what the ranch demanded. Clara was 12 and had decided she wanted to be a doctor, which in 1900 was an ambition that required considerable external assistance, and which Mabel pursued on her daughter's behalf with the same quiet, focused determination she brought to all important projects. George was 6 and in school, and had already demonstrated a talent for mathematics that delighted Mabel and mildly awed Milton, who was perfectly competent with figures but not what anyone would call gifted. Milton turned 48 in 1900, and his hair had gone to gray at the temples, which Mabel found distinguished and told him so directly. She was 43 herself, and her auburn hair had lightened without losing its warmth, and the life she had lived was in her face, not as erosion but as depth, as evidence of a person who had felt many things and processed them and continued. They sat on the porch on a warm October evening in 1900, the same porch where they had sat through all the evenings of their marriage, though the chairs were different now, he having built a proper porch bench in 1891 that could hold 2 people side by side, which was an act of carpentry so quietly significant that she had said nothing about it at the time except "thank you" and held his hand. Thomas was inside studying. Clara was writing a letter to a school in Philadelphia that offered women a path toward medical training, a letter Mabel had helped her compose with great care. George was asleep, small and self-contained in his room. The October air carried the cedar smell and the grassland smell and the cool front coming in from the north that would be a proper chill by morning. The stars were beginning. "Do you ever think about it?" Milton asked. She knew what he meant. They had been married long enough that she frequently knew what he meant. "Which part specifically?" she said. "That morning," he said. "The deed," she considered it. "Sometimes," she said. "When I'm grading district reports at my desk late in the evening, occasionally I think about the January Tuesday when you came to the schoolroom, and then I think forward to August and the deed and all of it." "What do you feel when you think about it?" She looked at the darkening sky. "Gratitude," she said, "that I was the kind of person who could do it, that I had the means, that I didn't let pride stop me any more than your pride could stop me." She paused. "And also something that might be called satisfaction, though it sounds small for what it actually is." "What do you mean?" "I mean," she said carefully, "that there is a particular satisfaction in loving someone in the way they actually need to be loved rather than the way that is easiest or most comfortable. You needed someone to do the thing you would never ask for. I was able to do it. And then she stopped, and when she continued her voice was warm with everything that the following years had added to her original certainty. "You became the kind of man who learned to receive love without converting it into debt. That is not a small thing, that is an enormous thing, and I got to watch it happen." He was quiet for a moment. The October stars were fully out now. "I was a difficult man to love," he said. not with self-pity, just as an accurate statement. "You were a contained man," she said. "There's a difference. Everything was there, it just needed to be let out into the air." "You let it out," he said. "You let me," she said. "That was the harder part." He turned to look at her. In the light from the house window, his face was familiar in every detail, every line and plane of it, the years of it, all the expressions she had catalogued and loved. He looked at her the way he had always looked at her since January of 1883, with the complete, focused attention of a man who saw her. "Mabel," he said. "Yes. You saved the ranch," he said. "You saved considerably more than that." She reached over on the porch bench and took his hand, and he closed both of his around it, and they sat together in the October dark on the porch of the ranch that was his father's and his and theirs, looking out over the land that they had held together through all the storms the world had sent, and nothing needed to be said. The stars above the Texas hill country did not care about human stories, but they were very beautiful that night, and they burned with the complete indifference of things that are too large to be troubled. And below them, on a wooden porch bench, two people who had found each other in the most complicated and sideways and perfect way sat close together in the dark, and were, without qualification, without remainder, entirely at peace. Clara Hadley was accepted to the women's medical program in Philadelphia in 1902, and went east with her mother's steady confidence and her father's jaw, and a determination that was entirely her own. Thomas married a woman named Ruth Prewitt in 1903, Danny Prewitt's younger sister, which produced a satisfaction in Mabel that she described to Milton as cosmically appropriate, given how it had all begun with Danny's reading lessons. Milton laughed at that, a full and genuine laugh, and said that if you followed any thread long enough in a small community, you eventually arrived back at the beginning. George Hadley grew up to study mathematics in Austin and came home to Colton to work the county land office, where his facility with figures made him extraordinarily useful, and where he was, by all accounts, a deeply contented man. The Hadley ranch passed to Thomas in time, whole and strong and free of any debt, its deed clean and unencumbered, a piece of property that had come very close to being lost once, on a hot August morning in 1883, and which had been saved by a woman who had not been asked. But what was saved on that morning, what truly and permanently survived it, was not land or deed or legal title. It was the opening of a man who had been sealed against his own heart for a very long time. It was the recognition, slow and effortful and real, that strength and help receiving were not opposites. It was a love that had begun in the middle of a crisis, and had been built, day by day and year by year and choice by choice, into something that held. Mabel Hadley lived to 71, clear-minded and direct until nearly the end, teaching long past when most people would have stopped, because she found it impossible to stop doing a thing that made the world better. Milton lived to 75, working the land in a diminished capacity into his last years, because it was where he understood himself most fully, and because the land did not ask you to explain yourself. It just received what you gave it and gave back what it could. They were buried in the Colton churchyard under a single stone in the shade of an oak that had been a sapling in 1883 and was very large by the time they no longer needed the shade. The stone said, "Milton Hadley, 1852-1927. Mabel Keene Hadley, 1857-1928. Together, what was needed was provided," which was, their children all agreed, exactly right.